Hello and welcome to India Reads. My name is Pradeep and we are reading the story of My Experiments with Truth by Mahatma Gandhi. We've reached the stage in his story where he has arrived in India. He has a few issues about which he writes to the government of India and he's trying to set it right. During which time he also has an invitation to go to Shantiniketan. So he proceeds from Rajkot to Shantiniketan and that's where we start the chapter. Let's start. Shantiniketan. From Rajkot, I proceeded to Shantiniketan. The teachers and students overwhelmed me with affection. The reception was a beautiful combination of simplicity, art, and love. It was here I met Kaka Sahib Kalelkar for the first time. I did not know then why Kalelkar was called Kaka Sahib, but I later learned on that Sergeant Keshavrao Deshpande, who was a contemporary and close friend of mine in England, and who had conducted a school in the Baroda state called Ganganath Vidyalaya, had given teachers family names with a view of to investing the Vidyalaya with a family atmosphere. Kalelkar, who was a teacher there, came to be known as called Kaka, literally paternal uncle. Fadki was called Mama, literally maternal uncle, and Harihar Sharma received the name Anna, literally brother. Others got similar names, Anandanand Swami as Kaka's friend and Patwardhan Appa as Mama's friend, later joined the family, and all in course of time became my co-workers one after another. Sergeant Deshpande used to be called Sahib. When the Vidyalaya had to be dissolved, the family also broke, but they never gave up their spiritual relationship or their assumed names. Kaka Sahib went on to gain experience of different institutions, and at the time I went to Shantiniketan, he happened to be there. Chintaman Shastri, belonging to the same fraternity, was also there. Both helped in teaching Sanskrit. The Phoenix family had been assigned separate quarters at Shantiniketan. Maganlal Gandhi was their head, and he made it his business to see that all the rules of the Phoenix ashram should be scrupulously observed. I saw that by the dint of his love, knowledge, and perseverance, he had made his fragrance felt in the whole of Shantiniketan. Andrews was also there, as also Pearson. Among the Bengali teachers with whom we came in fairly close contact were Jagadanand Babu, Nepal Babu, Santosh Babu, Kshiti Mohan Babu, Nagin Babu, Sharad Babu, and Kali Babu. As is my wont, I quickly mixed with the teachers and students and engaged them in a discussion on self-help. I put it to the teachers that if they and the boys dispense with the services of the paid cooks and cook their food themselves, it would enable the teachers to control the kitchen from the point of view of the boys' physical and moral health, and it would afford to the student an object lesson in self-help. One or two of them were inclined to shake their heads. Some of them strongly approved the proposal. The boys welcomed it, if only because of their instinctive taste for novelty. So when we launched the experiment, When I invited the poet to express his opinion, he said that he did not mind it provided the teachers were favorable. To the boys, he said, the experiment contains the key to Swaraj. Pearson began to wear away his body in making the experiment a success. He threw himself into it with zest. A batch was formed to cut vegetables, another to clean the grain, and so on. Nagin Babu and others undertook to see to the sanitary cleaning of the kitchen and its surroundings. It was a delight to me to see them working spade in hand. But it was too much to expect the 125 boys with their teachers to take to this work of physical labor like ducks to water. There used to be a daily discussion. Some began early to show fatigue, but Pearson was not the man to be tired. One would always find him with a smiling face doing something or the other in or about the kitchen. He had taken upon himself the cleaning of bigger utensils. A party of students played on the sitar before this cleaning party in order to beguile the tedium of the operation. All alike took the thing up with zest, and Shantiniketan became a busy hive. Things like these, when once begun, always develop. Not only was the Phoenix party's kitchen self-conducted, but the food cooked in it was one of the simplest. Condiments were skewed, rice, dal, vegetables, and even wheat flour were all cooked at one and at the same time in a steam cooker. And Shantiniketan boys started a similar kitchen with a view to introducing reform in the Bengali kitchen. One or two teachers and some students ran this kitchen. This experiment was, however, dropped after some time. I am of the opinion that this famous institution lost nothing by having conducted the experiment for a brief interval, and some of the experiences gained could not but be of help to the teachers. I had intended to stay in Shantiniketan for some time, but fate willed otherwise. I had been there for a week when I received from Pune a telegram announcing Gokhale's death. Shantiniketan was immersed in grief. All the members came over to me to express their condolences. A special meeting was called in the ashram temple to mourn the national loss. It was a solemn occasion. The same day I left for Pune with my wife and Maganlal. All the rest stayed in Shantiniketan. Andrews accompanied me up to Bardwan. Do you think, he asked me, that a time will come for Satyagraha in India? And if so, do you have any idea when will it come? It is difficult, said I. For 1 year, I am to do nothing. For Gokhale took from me a promise that I should travel in India for gaining experience and express no opinion on public questions until I have finished the period of probation. Even after the year is over, I will not be in a hurry to speak and pronounce opinions, and so I do not suppose there will be any occasion for Satyagraha for 5 years or so. I may note in this connection that Gokhale used to laugh at some of my ideas in Hind Swaraj, India Home Rule, and say, after you've stayed a year in India, your views will correct themselves. Woes of third-class passengers. At Bardwan, we came face to face with the hardships that a third-class passenger has to go through even in securing his ticket. Third-class tickets are not booked so early, we were told. I went to the station master, though that too was a difficult business. Somebody kindly directed me where he was, and I represented to him our difficulty. He made the same reply. As soon as the booking window opened, I went to purchase the tickets, but it was not an easy thing to get them. Might was right, and passengers who came forward and indifferent to others, coming one after the other, continued to push me out. I was therefore about the last of the first crowd to get a ticket. The train arrived, and getting into it was another trial. There was a free exchange of abuse and pushes between passengers already in the train and those trying to get in. We ran up and down the platform, but were everywhere met with the same reply: no room here. I went to the guard. He said, you must try to get in where you can or take the next train. But I have urgent business, I respectfully replied. He had no time to listen to me. I was disconcerted. I told Maganlal to get in wherever possible, and I got into an interclass compartment with my wife. The guard saw us getting in. At the Asansol station, he came to charge us the excess fare. I said to him, it was your duty to find us room. We could not get any, so we are sitting here. Only if you can accommodate us in the third class compartment, we shall be only glad to go there. You may not argue with me, said the guard. I cannot accommodate you. You must pay the excess fare or get out. I wanted to reach Pune somehow. I was therefore not prepared to fight the guard, so I paid the excess fare he demanded, that is up to Pune, but I resented the injustice. In the morning, we reached Mughal Sarai. Maganlal had managed to get a seat in the third class, to which I now shifted. I acquainted the ticket examiner with all the facts and asked him to give me a certificate to the effect that I had shifted to third class compartment at Mughal Sarai, but he declined to do so. I applied to the railway authorities for redress and got a reply to the effect: it is not our practice to refund excess fares without the production of a certificate, but we will make an exception in your case. It is not possible, however, to refund the excess fare from Bardwan to Mughal Sarai. Since this, I have had experiences of third class travelling, which if I wrote them all down would easily fill a volume. But I can only touch on them casually in these chapters. It has been and always will be my profound regret that physical incapacity should have compelled me to give up third class travelling. The woes of third class passengers are undoubtedly due to the high-handedness of railway authorities. But the rudeness, dirty habits, selfishness, ignorance of the passengers themselves are no less to be blamed. The pity is that they often do not realize that they are behaving ill, dirtily, or selfishly. They believe that everything they do is in natural way. All this may be traced to the indifference towards them of us educated people. We reached Kalyan dead tired. Maganlal and I got some water from the station water pipe and had our bath. As I was proceeding to arrange for my wife's bath, Sergeant Call of the Servants of India Society, recognizing us, came up. He too was going to Pune. He offered to take my wife to the second class bathroom. I hesitated to accept the courteous offer. I knew that my wife had no right to avail herself of the second class bathroom, but I ultimately connived at the impropriety. This I know does not become a votary of the truth, not that my wife was eager to use the bathroom, but her husband's partiality for his wife got the better of his partiality for the truth. The face of truth is hidden behind the golden veil of Maya, says the Upanishad. Wooing. On arrival in Pune, we found ourselves after the performance of the Shraddh ceremonies discussing the future of the society and the question as to whether I should join it or not. The question of membership proved a very delicate matter for me to handle. Whilst Gokhale was there, I did not have to seek admission as a member. I had to simply obey his wish, a position I loved to be in. Launching on the stormy sea of public life, Indian public life, I was in dire need of a sure pilot. I had one in Gokhale and had felt secure in his keeping. Now that he was gone, I was thrown on my own resources, and I felt that it was my duty to seek admission. That I thought would please Gokhale's spirit, so without hesitation and with firmness, I began the wooing. Most of the members of the society were in Pune at this juncture. I set about pleading with them and tried to dispel their fears about me, but I saw that they were divided. One section favored my admission, the other was strongly against it. I knew that neither yielded to the other in its affection for me, but possibly their loyalty to the society was greater, at any rate not less than their love for me. All our discussions were therefore free from bitterness and strictly confined to matters of principle. The section that was opposed to me held that they and I were poles asunder in various vital matters, and they felt my membership was likely to imperil the very objects for which the society was founded. This naturally was more than they could bear. We dispersed after prolonged discussions, the final decision being postponed to a later date. I was considerably agitated as we returned home. Was it right for me to be admitted by a majority vote? Would it be a consonant with my loyalty to Gokhale? I clearly saw that when there was a sharp division amongst the members of the society over admitting me, by far the best course for me was to withdraw my application for admission and save those opposed to me from the delicate situation. Therein I thought lay my loyalty to the society in Gokhale. The decision came to me in a flash and immediately wrote to Mr. Shastri asking him not to have the adjourned meeting at all. Those who had opposed my application fully appreciated that the decision. It saved them from an awkward position and bound us in closer bonds of friendship. The withdrawal of my application made me truly a member of the society. Experience now tells me that it was well that I did not formally become a member and that the opposition of those who had been against me was justified. Experience has shown also that our views on matters of principle were widely divergent, but the recognition of the differences has made no estrangement or bitterness between us. We have remained as brothers, and the society's Pune home has always been for me a place of pilgrimage. It is true that I did not become officially a member of the society, but I have been a member in spirit. Spiritual relationship is far more precious than physical. Physical relationships divorced from spiritual is body without soul. Kumbh Mela. I next went to Rangoon to meet Dr. Mehta and on my way halted at Calcutta. I was the guest of the late Babu Bhupendranath Basu. Bengali hospitality reached its climax here. In those days, I was a strict fruitarian, so all the fruits and nuts available in Calcutta were ordered for me. The ladies of the house kept awake all night skinning various fruits, various nuts. Every possible care was taken in dressing fresh fruit in the Indian style. Numerous delicacies were prepared for my companions, amongst whom was my son Ramdas. Much as I could appreciate this affectionate hospitality, I could not bear the thought of a whole household being occupied in entertaining 2 or 3 guests. But as yet, I saw no escape from such embarrassing attentions. On the boat going to Rangoon, I was a deck passenger. If excess of attention embarrassed us in Sergeant Basu's house, grossest inattention even to elementary comforts of deck passengers was our lot on the boat. What was an apology for a bathroom was unbearably dirty. The latrines were stinking sinks. To use the latrine, one had to wade through urine and excreta or jump over them. There was more flesh and blood could bear. This was more than flesh and blood could bear. I approached the chief officer without avail. If anything was lacking to complete the picture of stink and filth, passengers furnished it by their thoughtless habits. They spat where they sat, dirtied the surroundings with leavings of the food, tobacco, and betel leaves. There was no end to the noise, and everyone tried to monopolize as much as possible. The luggage took more room than we had thus 2 days of the severest trial. On reaching Rangoon, I wrote to the agent of the steamship company, acquainting him with all the facts. Thanks to this letter and Dr. Mehta's efforts in the matter, the return journey, though on deck, was less unbearable. In Rangoon, my fruitarian diet was again a source of additional trouble to the host, but since Dr. Mehta's home was as good as my own, I could control somewhat the lavishness of the menu. However, as I had not set any limit to the number of articles I might eat, the palate and the eyes refused to put an effective check on the supply of the varieties order. There were no regular hours for meals. Personally, I preferred having the last meal before nightfall. Nevertheless, as a rule, it could not be had before 8 or 9. This year, 1915, was the year of the Kumbh Mela, which is held at Haridwar once in 12 years. I was by no means eager to attend the fair, but I was anxious to meet Mahatma Munshiram, who was in his Gurukul. Gokhale Society had sent a big volunteer corps for service at the Kumbh. Pandit Hridaynath Kunzru was at the head, and the late Dr. Dev was the medical officer. I was invited to send the Phoenix party to assist them, so Maganlal Gandhi had already preceded me. On my return from Rangoon, I joined the band. The journey from Calcutta to Haridwar was particularly trying. Sometimes the compartments had no lights. From Saharanpur, we were huddled into carriages for goods or cattle. These had no roofs, and what with the blazing midday sun overhead and the scorching iron floor beneath, we were all but roasted. The pangs of thirst caused by even such a journey as this could not persuade Orthodox Hindus to take water. If it was Musalmani, they waited until they could get Hindu water. These very Hindus, let it be noted, do not much as hesitate or inquire when during illness the doctor administers them wine or prescribes beef, or Musalman or Christian comforter gives them water. Our stay in Shantiniketan had taught us that the scavengers' work would be our special function in India. Now for the volunteers at Haridwar, tents had been pitched at a dharmashala. In a dharmashala, it's actually. And Dr. Dev had dug some pits to be used as latrines. He had to depend on paid scavengers to looking after these. Here was the work for the Phoenix party. We offered to cover up the excreta with earth and to see to their disposal, and Dr. Dev gladly accepted our offer. The offer was naturally made by me, but it was Maganlal Gandhi who had to execute it. My business was mostly to keep sitting in the tent, giving darshan, holding religious and other discussions with numerous pilgrims who called upon me. This left me not a minute which I could call my own. I was followed even to the bathing ghat by these darshan seekers. Nor did they leave me alone whilst I was having my meals. Thus in Haridwar that I realized what a deep impression my humble services in South Africa had made throughout the whole of India. But this was no enviable position to be in. I felt as though I was in between the devil and the deep sea. When no one recognized me, I had to put up with the hardships that fall to the lot of millions of this land. Example in railway travelling. Whereas surrounded by people who had heard of me, I was a victim of their craze for darshan. Which of the two conditions was more pitiable, I have often been at loss to determine. This at least I know, that the darshanwala's blind love has made me angry and more often sore at heart, whereas travelling, though often trying, has been uplifting and has hardly ever roused me to anger. It was on one of those days, it was in those days strong enough, I was in those days strong enough to roam about a lot, and was fortunately not so known as not to be able to go out in streets without creating much fuss. During these roamings, I came to observe more of the pilgrims' absent-mindedness, hypocrisy, and slovenliness than of their piety. The swarm of sadhus who had descended there seemed to have been born to enjoy the good things of life. Here I saw a cow with 5 feet. I was astonished, but knowing men soon disillusioned me. The poor 5-footed cow was a sacrifice to the greed of the wicked. I learned that the fifth foot was nothing else but a foot cut off from a live calf and grafted upon the shoulder of the cow. The result of this double cruelty was exploited to fleece the ignorant of their money. There was no Hindu that would be attracted to by a 5 foot cow, but no Hindu but would lavish his charity on such a miraculous cow. The day of the fair was upon us now. It proved a red letter day for me. I had not gone to Haridwar with the sentiments of the pilgrims. I had never thought of frequenting places of pilgrimage in search of piety. But the 17 lakhs of men that were reported to be there could not all be hypocrites or mere sightseers. I had no doubt the countless people amongst them had gone there to earn merit and for self purification. It is difficult, if not impossible, to say to what extent this kind of faith uplifts the soul. I therefore passed the whole night immersed in deep thought. There were these pious souls in the midst of hypocrisy that surrounded them. They would be free of guilt before their Maker. If the visit to Haridwar was in itself a sin, I must publicly protest against it and leave Haridwar on the day of the Kumbh. If the pilgrims to Haridwar and then to Kumbh was not sinful, I must impose some act of self-denial on myself in atonement for the iniquity prevailing there and purify myself. This was quite natural to me. My life is based on disciplinary resolutions. I thought of the unnecessary trouble I had caused to my host at Calcutta and Rangoon, who had so lavishly entertained me. I therefore decided to limit the articles of my daily diet and have my final meal before sunset. I was convinced that if I did not impose these restrictions to myself, I should put my future host to considerable inconvenience and should engage them in serving me rather than engage myself in service. So I pledged myself never whilst in India to take more than 5 articles in 24 hours and never to eat after dark. I gave the fullest thought to the difficulties I might have to face, but I wanted to leave no loophole. I rehearsed to myself what would happen during an illness if I counted medicine among the 5 articles and made no exceptions in favor of special articles of diet. I finally decided that there should be no exception on any account whatsoever. I have been under these vows for over 13 years now. They have subjected me to a severe test, but I am able to testify that they have also served as my shield. I am of the opinion that they have added a few years of my life and saved me from many an illness. Lakshman Jhula. It was a positive relief to reach the Gurukul and meet Mahatma Munshiramji with his giant flame. I at once felt the wonderful contrast between the peace of the Gurukul and the din and the noise of Haridwar. The Mahatma overwhelmed me with affection. The Brahmacharis were all attention. It was here that I was first introduced to Acharya Ramdev Ji, and I could immediately see what a force and power he must be. We had different viewpoints in several matters, nevertheless, our acquaintance soon ripened into friendship. I had long discussions with Acharya Ramdev Ji and other professors about the necessity of introducing industrial training into the Gurukul. When the time came for going away, it was a wrench to leave the place. I had heard much in praise of Lakshman Jhula, a hanging bridge over the Ganges some distance from Rishikesh, and many friends pressed me not to leave Haridwar without having gone as far as the bridge. I wanted to do this pilgrimage on foot, and so I did it in 2 stages. Many sannyasis called on me at Rishikesh. One of them was particularly attracted towards me. The Phoenix party was there, and their presence drew from the Swami many questions. We had discussions about religion, and he realized that I felt deeply about matters of religion. He saw me bareheaded and shirtless as I had returned from my bath at Ganges. He was pained to miss the shikha, tuft of hair, on my head and the sacred thread about my neck, and said, "It pains me to see you, a believing Hindu, going without a sacred thread and the shikha. These are the two external symbols of Hinduism, and every Hindu ought to wear them." Now there's a history as to how I came to dispense with both. When I was an urchin of 10, I envied the Brahmin lads sporting bunches of keys tied to their sacred threads, and I wish I could do likewise. The practice of wearing the sacred thread was then not common among the Vaishya families in Kathiawar, but a movement had just started for making it obligatory for the first 3 Varnas. As a result, several members of the Gandhi clan adopted the sacred thread. A Brahmin who was teaching 2 or 3 of us boys Ram Raksha invested us with the thread, and although I had no occasion to possess a bunch of keys, I got one and began to sport it. Later, when the thread gave away, I do not remember whether I missed it very much, but I know that I did not go in for a fresh one. As I grew up, several well-meaning attempts were made both in India and South Africa to reinvest me with the secret thread, but with little success. If the Shudras may not wear it, I argued, what right have the other Varnas to do so? And I saw no adequate reason for adopting what was to me an unnecessary custom. I had no objection to the thread as such, but the reasons for wearing it were lacking. As a Vaishnava, I had naturally worn around my neck the kanthi, and the shikha were considered obligatory by the elders. On the eve of my going to England, however, I got rid of the shikha, lest when I was bareheaded it should expose me to ridicule and make me look, as I then thought, a barbarian in the eyes of the Englishmen. In fact, this cowardly feeling carried me so far that in South Africa I got my cousin Chaganlal Gandhi, who was religiously wearing the shika, to do away with it. I feared that it might come in the way of his public work, and so, even at the risk of paining him, I made him get rid of it. I therefore made a clean breast of the whole matter to the Swami and said, I will not wear the sacred thread, as I see no necessity for it when countless Hindus can go without it and yet remain Hindus. Moreover, the sacred thread should be a symbol of spiritual regeneration, presupposing a deliberate attempt on the part of the wearer at a higher and purer life. I doubt whether in the present state of Hinduism and of India, Hindus can vindicate the right to wear a symbol charged with such a meaning. That right can come only after Hinduism has purged itself of untouchability, removed all distinctions of superiority and inferiority, and shed a host of other evils and shams that have become rampant in it. My mind therefore rebels against the idea of wearing the sacred thread. I am sure your suggestion about the shika is worth considering. I once used to have it, but I discarded it from a false sense of shame, and so I feel that I should start growing again. I shall discuss the matter with my comrades. The Swami did not appreciate my position with regard to the sacred thread. The very reasons that seemed to me to point to not wearing it appeared to him to favor its wearing. Even today, my position remains about the same as it was at Rishikesh. So long as there are different religions, every one of them may need some outward distinctive symbol. But when a symbol is made into a fetish and as an instrument of proving the superiority of one's religion over others, it is fit only to be discarded. The sacred thread does not appear to me today to be a means of uplifting Hinduism. I am therefore indifferent to it. As for the shikha, cowardice having been the reason for discarding it, after the consultation with friends, I have decided to regrow it. But to return to Lakshman Jhula, I was charmed by the natural scenery about Rishikesh. But to return to Lakshman Jhula, I was charmed with the natural scenery about Rishikesh and the Lakshman Jhula, and bowed my head in reverence to our ancestors for their sense of the beautiful in nature and for their foresight in investing beautiful manifestation of nature with a religious significance. But the way in which men were using these beauty spots was far from giving me peace. As at Haridwar and so at Rishikesh, people dirtied their roads and the fair banks of the Ganges. They did not hesitate to desecrate sacred water of the Ganges. It filled me with agony to see people performing natural functions on the thoroughfares and river banks when they could have easily gone a little farther from their public haunts. Lakshman Jhula was, as I saw, nothing but an iron suspension bridge over the Ganges. I was told that originally there had been a fine rope bridge, but a philanthropic Marwadi got into his head to destroy the rope bridge and erect an iron one at heavy cost and then entrusted the keys to the government. I am at loss to say anything about the rope bridge as I have never seen it, but the iron bridge is entirely out of place in such surroundings and mars the bare beauty. The making over of the keys of this pilgrim's bridge to the government was too much even for my loyalty of those days. The Swargashram which one reaches after crossing the bridge was a wretched place, being nothing but a number of shabby looking sheds of galvanized iron sheets. These, I was told, were made for sadhakas, aspirants. There was hardly any living at the moment. Those in the main building gave one an unfavorable impression. But the Haridwar experiences proved to me of inestimable value. They helped me in no small way to decide where I was to live and what I was to do, the founding of the ashram. The pilgrimage of the Kumbh fair was my second visit to Haridwar. The Satyagraha ashram was founded on the 25th of May 1915. Shraddhanand ji wanted me to settle in Haridwar. Some of my Calcutta friends recommended Vaidyanath Dham. So others strongly urged me to choose Rajkot, but when I happened to pass through Ahmedabad, many friends pressed me to settle down there, and they volunteered to find the expenses of the ashram as well as the house for us to live in. I had a predilection for Ahmedabad. Being a Gujarati, I thought I should be able to render the greatest service to the country through the Gujarati language, and then as Ahmedabad was an ancient center for handloom weaving, it was likely to be the most favorable field for revival of the cottage industry of hand spinning. There was also the hope that the city, being the capital of Gujarat, monetary help from its wealthy citizens would be more available here than elsewhere. The question of untouchability was naturally among the subjects discussed with the Ahmedabad friends. I made clear to them that I should take the first opportunity of admitting an untouchable candidate to the ashram if he was otherwise worthy. Where is the untouchable who will satisfy our conditions? Said a Vaishnava friend self complacently. I finally decided to found the ashram at Ahmedabad. So far as accommodation was concerned, Sergeant Jeevan Lal Desai, barrister in Ahmedabad, was so far as accommodation was concerned, Jeevan Lal Desai, barrister in Ahmedabad, was the principal man to help me. He offered to let, and we decided to hire his Kochra bungalow. The first thing we had to settle was the name of the ashram. I consulted friends. Among the names suggested were Sevashram, the abode of service, Tapovan, the abode of austerities, etc. I like this name Sevashram, but for the absence of the emphasis on the method of service. Tapovan seemed to me a pretentious title, because even though tapas was dear to us, we would not presume to be tapasvins, men of austerity. Our creed was a devotion to truth, and our business was a search for and insistence on truth. I wanted to acquaint India uh, with the method I tried in South Africa, and I decided to test in India the extent to which its application might be possible. So my companions and I selected the name Satyagraha Ashram as conveying both our goal and our method of service. As for the conduct of the ashram, the code of rules and observances were necessary. A draft was prepared and friends were invited to express their opinions on it. Among the many opinions that were received were that of Sir Gurdas Banerjee, still fresh in my memory. He liked the rules but suggested that humility should be added as one of the observances, as he believed that the younger generation sadly lacked humility. Though I noticed this fault, I feared that humility would cease to be humility the minute it became a matter of vow. The true connotation of humility is self-effacement. Self-effacement is moksha, salvation, and vice. It cannot by itself be an observance. There might be other observances necessary for its attainment. If the act of an aspirant after moksha or servant have no humility or selflessness about them, there is no longing for moksha service. Service without humility is selfishness and egotism. There were at this time about 13 Tamilians in our party, 5 Tamilian youngsters that accompanied me from South Africa, and the rest came from different parts of the country. We were in all about 25 men and women. That's how the ashram started. All had the meals in common kitchen and strove to live as one family. With this, we come to the end of today's reading. It, today's reading has all been about Gandhi's experience at Shanti Niketan. Uh, his people from the Tolstoy farm, uh, uh, was it just the Tolstoy farm, or was it anyways, the people from his group in South Africa, his close-knit group in South Africa, move the Phoenix farm, right? Phoenix farm move into Shanti Niketan, and led by Maganlal Gandhi. Gandhi goes there and spends some time there. He earns a lot of respect and love and admiration from the students there. He also brings in some amount of changes. He asks why should there be a special mess? Why can't the students and teachers cook together? Wouldn't that mean that they also do a bit of physical work and learn to be self-reliant and also save expenses? You know, the typical Gandhian way of looking at things. And this was accepted and followed for a certain period of time. The experiment, however, was not made permanent, but Gandhi feels that the fact that they took the experiment itself is a good sign. Gandhi spent some time in Shantiniketan, but he had to rush back to Pune on hearing the sad demise of his mentor Gokhale. Uh, A lot of these chapters talk about Gandhi's experiences in traveling. Gandhi insisted on traveling in third class. He did that even when he came from the steamer from England to India. And in India, he consistently tried to travel in third class. However, over a period of time, he realized that it would not work out because it was really filthy and dirty, and it really gave him a sense of how poor people would be traveling in India, and he felt that the only way that it could be improved was when richer people or people who are entitled like him travel and raise complaints about it. Gandhi did raise a complaint. He went through a lot of experiences. He found that his third class seat was not confirmed, so he kind of moved into the second class without doing it legally. And when he was issued a fine, he had two options: whether to get off the train or go ahead, since he was going for the last rites, or rather the memorial of Gokhale. He could not afford to take any risks, so he decided to pay the fine. But after a period, he got the seat confirmed, and he had moved to, in fact, to the second class, and therefore he wrote for a refund to the railways. Of course, he did not get that. uh, Once he reached Pune, he spent some time at the Society of Gokhale. Gandhi initially asked for membership, and then he found that the whole committee was divided about his getting membership in the society. Some felt that he would add a lot of value. The others felt that his way of thinking will not help the society. Gandhi realized that if he is dividing the society, it's not worth for him to be part of it. He, however, was there in spirit, and he felt that that's the way he would like to continue. Uh, Gandhi spends a lot of time also talking a little bit about the various classes in Hindu society. Uh, this is when he was doing his trip in Haridwar. He had gone for the Kumbh Mela, and it was a phenomenal experience for Gandhi, who had not seen something like this before. While he was in Kumbh Mela, from there he had been advised by all his friends to go to Lakshman Jhula, and that's when he realized that all these places, which were so beautiful and pristine, were made kept really dirty and unclean and filthy by the Indian people, and this is something that disturbed him to a great extent. He did not see a point to uh, keep all these classes or castes in Hindu society. He was a Vaishnavite, and a lot of many of the Vaishnavites used to wear the sacred thread, and they used to have a symbol, what he calls as a shakha, in their forehead. Gandhi had stopped wearing the thread because he felt that he did not need that, and not every Hindu needed that. And if it was not required for all the lower castes, then it was not required for him. That's the way Gandhi saw Gandhi's philosophy worked. And as far as his mark on the forehead, or rather the shikha on the forehead, he had removed it during his days of going to England, as he did not want it to be prominent. So it came out of a place of embarrassment. Actually, he talks about the tuft of hair, in fact, on his head, and he had eventually discussed with his friends and decided that he would bring it back. Uh, so yeah, that's about where I would like to leave here. These videos have not been very smooth. I've had 2 or 3 videos, so I'm going to stitch them together. There's been some issues with the camera, both this video and the earlier one, but we will try and figure out the logistics of it and make sure that we start producing a little bit of better quality, slightly higher quality videos as we go on. I hope that you are enjoying reading or listening to the story of my experiments with truth. If you have any comments, suggestions, do drop it in the comment section below. I will see you in the next video. Till then, take care. Bye bye. Good night.